Hi, I'm Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation. For democracy to work, people need to be well informed. That's why we work with academic experts to share their research and explain issues in the news. Everything we do is free to republish, but we need your support. Please donate to The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com or following the link in the show notes.
From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
Tony Abbott has always been torn between the life of the political actor on the one hand and that of the journalist and writer on the other. As Liberal leader, Abbott wrote battle lines, his personal manifesto. As Minister and Prime Minister, he always loved being on the op-ed pages of the newspapers. Post-parliamentary life, Abbott remains both political activist and writer. He has a distinct and very positive view of Australian history, and now he's produced a new book titled Australia, A History. Its cover proclaims how an ancient land became a great democracy. Tony Abbott joins us today. Tony Abbott, you write in your author's note, and I quote, "This is the book that should never have been needed." Why did you feel it was needed?
Michelle, I think Australia has a history to be proud of. It's not perfect, but on balance, it's a great story. I think these days there's too much focus on the downside, whether it's Indigenous dispossession, whether it's the White Australia policy. There is this sense of original sin, if you like, hanging over our country. I don't think it's justified. Yes, there were obvious problems for Indigenous people, given the clash of the ancient and the modern. But even at the very beginning, there was good intentions on the part of the early colonial governors. The good intentions didn't always work out well, particularly on the frontier. But in the end, I think we have to accept that it was inevitable that Australia would be settled, and that British settlement on balance has been overwhelmingly a good thing for every Australian, including eventually even Aboriginal Australia.
And why do you think the interpretations became more negative over recent decades?
Well, that's a very good question, Michelle. I suppose it was inevitable at some point that people would say, well, the Indigenous story needs to be told as well. And, I don't always agree with people like Henry Reynolds, for instance, but Henry Reynolds' work, or at least the works that I'm familiar with, does at least try to acknowledge that many of the settlers were full of decency and benevolence towards Aboriginal people, even if some of them were rather the opposite. And I think what we need to do is try to judge our forebears not by our standards, but by the best standards of their time, and even by the best standards of their time. Our forebears don't emerge too badly. Many of them emerge very, very well indeed.
Your book is obviously very comprehensive in its scope. What period of Australia's history do you feel most attracted to, and what period do you think was most important in forging modern Australia?
Well, all of it I think is pretty good. I guess I've got a more personal involvement in the more recent history, the current affairs, if you like. But I think if you look back over our post-1788 history, there was the early convict period, there was the period of great pastoral expansion, there were the gold rushes and federation. A big part of that was the extraordinary political liberalisation, the pioneering democracy that Australia was, the great political laboratory that Australia was from the 1840s through to the 1890s. And then, of course, the wars, particularly the Great War, was a very formative experience for Australia. We still tend to think that our national character was forged at Gallipoli and on the battlefields of France. And so I guess it's all important, but some periods, I guess, we look back on as being more significant than others.
I suppose what I'm asking is, if you didn't live now, when would you have liked to have lived?
That's a good question. We don't choose the times we live in. It's God who chooses them for us, providence that chooses them for us. I'm happy to be living now, but I guess if I could choose, I suppose to have been here at the very beginning, at the very start of the modern Australian story would have been pretty interesting.
Now, immigration is obviously a big debate in Australia at the moment. What do you see as the importance of immigration in our past, and how well as a nation are we handling it now?
My thesis, if you like, Michelle, is that there are three pillars upon which modern Australia rests: the Indigenous heritage, the British Foundation, and the immigrant character. Different people will put different weight on those three pillars. Unsurprisingly, I put quite a bit of weight on the British Foundation, but immigration has really been central to the Australian story since 1788, settlement and subsequent immigration. The story of Australia has been how people have come here to make a better life in a new land, and by and large have left behind the antagonisms of the past. Yes, there was the Vinegar Hill or Castle Hill Rebellion back in the early 1800s when a group of Irish convicts inspired by events in Ireland decided that they would throw off the British yoke and create a free convict land, so to speak, here. But generally speaking, all of our immigrants from 1788 to this very day have come to Australia to join us, not to change us. I'm not a big fan of the policy of multiculturalism, and I do think that one difference between the post-war immigration and contemporary immigration is that the post-war migrants were expected by officialdom to integrate immediately and ultimately to assimilate. I think that migrants, almost to a man and a woman, from the beginning to this day, have very much wanted to become Australian as quickly as possible. But official policy in more recent times has, I think, sometimes encouraged people in a degree of, if you like, separateness. And I personally think that that goes against the grain of the average migrant and in the long run is suboptimal for our country.
Of course, it was a Liberal government, the Fraser government, that very much encouraged multiculturalism, wasn't it?
You're right, Michelle. And I think this was, well, I don't think it was, if you like, a high point of the Fraser government. The Fraser government has, I suppose, much to its credit, but there were certain aspects of Whitlamism that Fraser consolidated rather than rolled back, and multiculturalism and Indigenous separatism, if you like, were two Whitlamite innovations that Fraser did very much continue and even institutionalise.
Now, I was interested that you've admitted in the book that you changed your mind about what should have happened in 2007. You say that at the time you thought Howard shouldn't retire, but now you think that there should have been a transition before that election, sometime before that election, to Peter Costello, even though you still think the election would have been lost. What was your thinking in this change of mind?
Well, back then, Michelle, my very strong view was that the government without Howard would be weaker than the government with Howard. Howard was a wonderful Prime Minister, a terrific human being. What I underestimated back then, and I feel might have been different, is I underestimated, I guess, the burnout factor and also the boredom factor. The burnout factor in politicians who have been in office for a very long time, and the boredom factor in an electorate which, as it were, likes something new to revel in. I mean, I guess, Mercedes-Benz change their models every 5 or 10 years, even though the existing model might be fantastic, because they appreciate that the public does actually occasionally like something new. So it is what it is. And I must say that I don't think Peter Costello gets enough credit for the success of the Howard government. Peter was a wonderful treasurer, and had he been of a different character and temperament, the Howard government could easily have not lasted nearly as long or been nearly as successful. I guess it was my own experience as Prime Minister that reminded me that difficult colleagues can make for a very unstable tenure.
Now, just how difficult was it writing about your own period, your own experience? Because you must have been sort of struggling with the line between history, attempting to stand back, and memoir, attempting to explain, even get even.
Well, that's a good question, Michelle. Look, I think it was in 2016 that I wrote 3 essays for Quadrant about my time in government. And I wrote that back then because I wanted to get it off my chest. And my thinking back then and now is that I will leave the Abbott government essentially to the historians.
But you became a historian.
Well, I did, but you'll notice that the Abbott government gets about a half a page in a 400-page history. And given that the Abbott government only lasted for 2 years, I think that's about what it should get. There were some significant achievements, which I do mention, such as stopping the boats. But look, I wanted to tell the story of Australia. And yes, for a period, I was a part of the story, but I was never the whole story. And I think people are more interested in the story of our country than they are in the story of any particular Prime Minister.
Now, you still give the Liberal Party plenty of advice, and it certainly needs some advice at the moment. What do you think it should be doing to get out of its present hole?
Well, Michelle, look, 2 heavy defeats are obviously incredibly demoralising for a political party. And I'm making, if you like, a general observation here, as opposed to offering specific advice to my former colleagues. After defeat, the important thing is to try to work out what went wrong and to learn from those mistakes. And generally speaking, a government loses because it's run out of puff, doesn't have anything new to say to the public. And generally speaking, an opposition loses if it can't be a clear contrast to a poor government. And I think that if you go back to the 2022 election, the only really new thing that we had on offer was super for housing, which I actually thought was a very good idea, but it came out very late in the campaign and arguably was a mini policy rather than a maxi policy. I think if we look at the last election, the difficulty was that we had in our nuclear policy the germ of a much better approach to energy, but we didn't really campaign on it. And I think Labor had in its unrealised capital gains tax a quasi-wealth tax, but again, we didn't really campaign against that. It's interesting, and you're distracting me onto contemporary issues, Michelle, rather than a discussion of the book. But it's interesting that the campaign against the unrealised capital gains tax really only started after the election, and interestingly, Labor's now withdrawn it.
But you're saying on the one hand, there needs to be differentiation, which suggests that you think the party should be going towards the right. But the examples that you've given are really problems of execution, failures of execution in campaigning.
Yeah, and you're right. We should have campaigned more strongly for our nuclear policy, and we should have campaigned more strongly against Labor's wealth tax. But our job now, as I said back in 2009, and I think it's a pretty good template for oppositions, the job of an effective opposition is not to make weak compromises with a bad government, but to be a strong and clear and effective alternative.
But if the party does go to the right, which is what you're implying or saying, will that hamper its efforts to win the youth vote and the female vote, which it really has to do if it's got a chance of governing?
I don't like the idea of singling out people by characteristics. I think, to use a Howard phrase, what unites us should always be more important than anything that divides us. And I think the important thing is to appeal to people as Australians, as voters, as opposed to saying, well, you're a young person, let's pitch this way. You're a female, let's pitch that way.
But it doesn't work that way, does it?
Look, Michelle, I won 46% of the primary vote back in 2013, not by pitching specifically to young people or to women or to migrants, but by saying we're going to stop the boat, scrap the tax, fix the budget and build the roads. Successful conservative political movements are not highly ideological. They identify practical problems and come up with sensible ways of dealing with them. I was on about making the country better, and that meant fixing the problems of the day. And obviously we had a massive illegal migration problem, a border protection problem. We hadn't built serious infrastructure for a couple of decades. We had these absurd carbon and mining taxes, which were socialism masquerading as environmentalism, and we had a budget disaster. So I was focused on fixing problems. What we've got today, we've got a stagnant economy, we've got a fragmenting society, we've got strategic peril. Generally speaking, the Anglosphere, Australia included, has lost faith in itself, and we need to restore faith in our country. And I suppose writing this book, telling what I think is an overwhelmingly positive story about our country, is my attempt to help contemporary Australians think better of themselves.
I'm Gemma Ware, host of the Conversation Weekly podcast. Each week, I speak to an academic expert about a topic in the news to understand how we got here. From global politics to the latest scientific breakthroughs or the big dilemmas facing our planet. My guests draw on their deep research knowledge to pull out what really matters so that you can understand the context without the spin. Follow The Conversation Weekly for new episodes every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts, and read more stories on theconversation.com.
But I wonder to what extent the political scene has transformed in those years since your win, because you mentioned that you had a primary vote well into the 40s, right? Now, even Labor winning has a primary vote in the 30s, towards the lower end of the 30s, the Liberals around 30.
32, yeah. I think it was 32% for the Coalition and 35% for Labor at the last election, which are historically very poor
and
results.
Very, very different, though, than it used to be in terms of the role of minor parties, the role of independents.
Completely correct. And I think this is because mainstream leaders on both sides of the fence have failed to inspire over the last couple of decades. And I think it's very important that all serious political leaders do what they, you've got to level with the public. You've got to be straight with the public, which doesn't mean telling the public what they want to hear. I think that's been part of the problem, too much telling the public what they want to hear. It means telling the public what you honestly think are the problems and what you honestly think are the potential solutions, and where you think some things are insoluble, where you think some things are always going to be difficult, just generally being straight with people. And I think, Australians aren't mugs. I think our disenchantment with politics does not reflect so much on the people as it reflects on contemporary political leadership generally.
Now, as a Conservative in the Liberal Party, do you think that the description that Howard gave, particularly, of the broad church, of that party being a broad church between Conservatives and moderates, is still applicable, still relevant?
Any political party that aspires to win 50% of the vote, more or less, is going to be an internal coalition. Howard didn't use the term moderates. He said that the Liberal Party in this country is the political representative of both the liberal tradition of J.S. Mill and the conservative tradition of Edmund Burke. That was Howard's phraseology. He sometimes simplified it to say that he was an economic liberal and a social conservative. My approach to all this, Michelle, has been to say that as liberals, we believe in lower taxes, smaller government, greater freedom. As conservatives, we believe in the family, small business and institutions that have stood the test of time. Above all else, as patriots, we believe our country is the best in the world and want to keep it that way. So the Liberal Party in Australia has always been an amalgam of philosophical traditions, but I like to think that we have the potential to represent more Australians than any other major political party, because we're the Freedom Party, we're the Tradition Party, and above all else, we're the Patriot Party.
But can I put to you that amalgam is under incredible pressure at the moment? It's in danger of fracturing. Some people within the party think it would be better to have two parties. Could it go the way of the British Conservative Party, which is just being overtaken at the moment by the Farage Party?
Well, first of all, Michelle, I wouldn't write off the Conservative Party just yet. The British Conservative Party is the most successful political party in history, and there's a lot of inertia in politics. Next point I'd make is that I don't think there is so much disagreement on what's best inside the Liberal Party. I think there's more tactical disagreements about what is politically expedient. And if I may say so, the Liberals, I don't think there are too many Liberals who think that renewable energy is the answer for Australia. There are Liberals who think that the public has been brainwashed on climate change and we can't go against the brainwashing. And frankly, I think, if I may say so, that is a species of political cowardice. If you believe that something is right and you're not sure that the public agree with you, your job is to persuade the public not to go along with something that you think is wrong. And as a classic example of political strength, I would point to the Voice referendum, which was extremely popular. But then the Liberal Party, the National Party and others in the community argued very strongly for the best part of 18 months against it, and we all know what happened. The GST was never popular, but Howard persuaded a narrow political majority to at least put up with it.
Well, he nearly lost an election.
True, but in the end, he thought it was best to take a political risk on what was right. Ditto, the Hawke government did all sorts of things that, had you asked the public initially, they wouldn't have been popular. None of these economic reforms that the Hawke government did were initially popular, but the government did them because it believed they were right, and the government argued the case in the end successfully. And as I said, the job of political leadership is not to give people what they say they want. The job of political leadership is to give people what you believe they need, and successful political leadership is then persuading the public that actually they do need it after all.
Among the fractures and difficulties on the Conservative side of politics is the situation of the coalition at the moment. Obviously, the National Party and the Liberal Party are struggling to hold together in a policy sense, even a personal sense. Do you think the coalition will stay together through this term?
I'm a coalitionist. I've always somewhat facetiously said that a Liberal is a city national and a national is a country Liberal. I know some of my country Liberal colleagues get annoyed with me when I say that, but no, I'm very much a coalitionist. The Liberal Party does best when it is in a strong and effective coalition with the National Party, and likewise, the National Party best helps regional Australia when they're in a strong and effective coalition with the Liberal Party. I don't think it's an absolutely terrible thing if on occasions the National Party takes the lead. It was in fact the National Party that initially decided to oppose the Voice, thanks to the wonderful Jacinta Price, and several months later the Liberal Party did the same thing, and we all know how that turned out. So were the National Party, for argument's sake, to reject the net zero straitjacket, I don't think that would be a coalition buster, but I would expect that the Liberal Party at some point in time would come to the same position, simply because I think that's self-evidently the best way forward for Australia right now.
What would you be advising Barnaby Joyce to be doing?
Well, look, Barnaby is a great bloke. He's one of Australia's most effective retail politicians. I can understand his frustration at the present time. I hope that he reconsiders his decision to not stand again in New England. I hope he continues his campaign inside the National Party to get his party and ultimately the coalition putting forward the best and the strongest policy position.
So you don't think the flirtation with One Nation should go ahead?
I want to see a strong and effective alternative government. I don't want to see a proliferation of protest parties. And while I have considerable respect for Pauline Hanson, who I think in recent times has been certainly the most constructive of the crossbenchers as far as the coalition is concerned, I think that people should vote for the mainstream party that best reflects their values, because in the end what we need in this country are strong and stable governments, not a proliferation of parties which find it very difficult to come together and form cohesive governments.
I want to ask you about the Teals, because you lost your seat
To a proto-Teal, of course.
to a person who was really the first
Yes.
Teal, although she wasn't, Zali Steggall wasn't called a Teal at that time, but then became one of them, and then there were more. Did you underestimate that whole rise of the Teal movement, and how do you think the Liberals deal with it?
Well, we don't deal with it by out-tealing the Teals. We deal with it by coming up with strong policies on a whole range of topics. Now, when I was the member for Ringa, I obviously had lots of views on lots of subjects that were probably not entirely shared by my constituents. And I think intelligent voters realise that their local member is not going to see eye to eye with them on everything. I mean, I would often get letters from people as a local member saying, I don't agree with you on subject X and I'm never going to vote for you again. To which I would normally respond by saying, I accept that we don't see eye to eye on issue X, but maybe there are other issues that we will see eye to eye on, and thus on balance, you will find that I am, if you like, the least bad of the candidates, and you might on that basis be able to continue to support me. The Teal seats are not just interested in climate, they're also interested in economics. And if we can't satisfy them on climate, I think we might well be able to satisfy them on economics. And it's interesting that the one Teal seat that fell in the recent election, Goldstein, Tim Wilson campaigned very strongly for our nuclear policy and against Labor's unrealised capital gains tax policy. And the nuclear policy was a way of saying, look, if we really do have to get to net zero, the only way to do it and keep the lights on is with nuclear power. So good on Tim Wilson for that. And the people who are going to suffer most from Labor's confiscatory approach to wealth are obviously the people in the Teal seats. So I think we could have won more Teal seats back had we had a more robust approach to policy, not by simply trying to echo the Teals.
Now, just finally, Tony Abbott, we're sitting here today in Parliament House. I just wonder how much you miss the parliamentary life.
Well, I'm not going to tell you that I don't miss it. I've sometimes described what happens to former prime ministers as a bit like what happens to the captains of the rugby team, the national rugby team, for instance. First of all, you get put on the bench, then you get dropped from the squad, but you're still sitting in the stands, shouting at the players on the field. They don't take any notice of you. You still think that you're a better player than most of the people on the field, and yet the truth is the selectors are never going to go back to you. So, yes, of course I miss it, but I accept that that part of my life has passed, and the best thing I can do now is to try to, I guess, play a role in public life that is influential but no longer executive.
Well, there's obviously plenty of shouting left in you now. Tony Abbott, thank you very much for joining us today. Good luck with the book tour. That's all for today's Politics podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.